somewhere in the green hills of western Brittany, behind walls that have not been fully excavated in 600 years, sits the ruin of a castle called Tiffauges. The towers are partly collapsed. The lower chambers are partly sealed. Tourists walk the upper courtyards on weekends in summer and buy postcards at a small shop near the gate. Most of them do not know what they are walking on. Most of them have never been told. In the autumn of 1440, in the city of Nantes, a man was put on trial in front of the highest ecclesiastical court in the region. He was 36 years old. He was one of the richest men in France. He was a marshal of the realm, an honor granted to him at the age of 25 for his service in war. He had fought beside Joan of Arc at the siege of Orleans. He had stood guard at her side at the coronation of King Charles VII at Reims. He had been called, in his earlier years, a champion of the faith and a defender of the crown. He was convicted on the 25th of October of crimes that the court transcript describes in language so careful and so legal that it takes a modern reader some time to understand what is actually being said. The conservative count, accepted by most serious historians, places his victims at around 80. Some accounts, drawn from the surviving parish records of the villages around his castles, place the number closer to 200. A few of the more aggressive reconstructions go higher than that. All of them are children. Almost all of them are boys. Almost all of them are between the ages of 7 and 14. His name was Gilles de Rais, and 6 centuries later the historians, the lawyers, the theologians, and the forensic researchers who have examined his case still cannot fully agree on what happened. Not because the documents are missing. The documents are not missing. The trial transcripts survive in the archives of Nantes in over 200 pages of medieval Latin and French. The confessions survive. The witness statements survive. The names of the missing children survive. The disagreement is not about the documents. The disagreement is about the man. This is the story of a marshal of France who fought for a saint and ended on a gallows. It is the story of 2 body servants whose testimony broke one of the most powerful nobles in Europe. It is the story of a fairy tale you have heard since childhood and never knew was real. And it is the story of a question that 600 years have not been able to answer. Was he guilty or was he condemned? Part 2. To understand the size of what was lost when Gilles de Rais fell, you have to understand the size of what he was. He was born in September of 1404, almost certainly at the fortress of Champ-de-Sey on the Loire, into a family that had been accumulating land and titles in western France for 3 generations. His paternal grandfather, Gilles de Rais, was one of the wealthiest and most ruthless men in the region. His mother brought additional lands from the de Rais family of Brittany. When his parents died within months of each other in 1415, the boy of 11 inherited an estate that, in modern terms, would place him comfortably in the top tier of European wealth. By the time he was 25 years old, Gilles de Rais was the master of 15 castles. He owned land in 4 different French provinces. He commanded a personal army of around 200 men, fully equipped and paid out of his own treasury. His household included a private chapel with its own choir, a personal library of illuminated manuscripts that contemporaries described as one of the finest in France, and a domestic staff large enough to populate a small town. He wore cloth of gold to ordinary dinners. He gave away horses and jeweled cups the way other men gave away coins. When he traveled with a procession that was sometimes mistaken for the king's. His personal fortune at its height was, by the careful estimates of modern economic historians, larger than that of King Charles VII himself. This was not a metaphor. It was a problem. A subject who is richer than his king is a subject who exists at the king's discomfort. The treasure of his life in the most literal sense was his name and his land. And the strange thing about what happened to him, the thing that haunts the case even now, is how completely he threw it all away. There is a fairy tale that almost every child in the Western world has heard at some point. A wealthy nobleman with an unusual feature, a blue beard, marries a young woman and brings her to his castle. He gives her the keys to every room and forbids her to enter only one. She enters the forbidden room and finds the bodies of his previous wives. He returns home, discovers her disobedience, and prepares to kill her. She is saved at the last moment by her brothers. The story was written down by the French author Charles Perrault and published in 1697 in a collection called Histoires aux contes du temps passé. Perrault was a careful writer who drew on older oral traditions. The Bluebeard story did not appear in print before him, and folklorists have spent 3 centuries trying to trace its origin. The consensus position among serious scholars of French folklore is that Bluebeard descends, by a chain of village retellings, from the case of Gilles de Rais. Most people who have heard of Bluebeard have never been told he was real, and the real story, when you look at it directly, is darker and stranger than the fairy tale ever managed to be. Part 3. France in the early 15th century was a country dying in slow motion. The war that historians later called the 100 Years' War had been grinding through the French countryside for nearly a century by the time Gilles de Rais was born. English armies held Paris. The young Dauphin, Charles, who would later become King Charles VII, was hiding in the central French town of Bourges with a court that had no money, an army that had no morale, and a claim to the throne that the English refused to recognize. Whole provinces had been depopulated. Whole towns had been burned more than once. The roads were unsafe, the harvests failed, the plague returned. It was the kind of period that produces a particular type of nobleman. Men who had inherited castles and titles in a country that no longer had a functioning central authority found themselves operating as private warlords. They raised their own armies. They administered their own justice on their own lands. They answered, in practice, to no one except occasionally the king and rarely the church. The system that had produced them was breaking down around them, and many of them were too young to remember a time when it had worked properly. Gilles de Rais grew up inside that collapse. His parents died when he was 11, as has been mentioned, and his upbringing passed to his grandfather Gilles de Craon. Gilles de Craon was, by every contemporary account, a hard man. He was litigious, violent, and deeply concerned with the accumulation of land. He arranged for his grandson to be married at the age of 16 to a cousin named Catherine de Thouars, a marriage that brought additional Breton estates into the family. The marriage was performed without proper church dispensation. The grandfather did not consider this an obstacle. The dispensation was obtained afterward. This is the household that produced Gilles de Rais, a boy without parents, a grandfather who taught him that land was acquired and that obstacles were removed, an adolescent spent watching the adults around him take what they wanted from a country that could not stop them. He emerges into the historical record in his early 20s as a young man who is, by all accounts, brilliant. He spoke and read Latin fluently, which was unusual for a 15th-century French nobleman of any rank. He was musically educated. He was extravagantly devout, in the particular medieval style that combined enormous personal piety with a complete willingness to do violence in the name of the faith. He was generous with churches. He founded a chapel of his own, the Chapelle des Saints Innocents at Machical, and staffed it with a choir whose quality was talked about as far away as Paris. And he was, when the king finally called him to service in 1427, an extraordinarily effective soldier. Part 4. In late February of 1429, a peasant girl from the village of Domremy in Lorraine arrived at the court of the Dauphin in Chinon and asked to be allowed to lead the armies of France. The court was skeptical. The court was also desperate. Orleans, the last major French stronghold on the Loire, had been under English siege for 6 months and was expected to fall before summer. The Dauphin's advisers concluded, after questioning the girl and consulting with theologians at Poitiers, that nothing she could do would make their situation worse. She was given armor, a banner, a small escort, and the right to ride, with the relief army being assembled for Orleans. One of the noblemen assigned to her personal guard, by direct order of the Dauphin, was Gilles de Rais. He was 24 years old. She was 17. They rode north together in April of 1429. What followed is one of the most famous reversals in European military history. Orleans was relieved within 9 days of Joan's arrival. The English siege works were broken. The French army, which had been losing for a generation, began to win. Through May and June of 1429, the relief force fought its way north along the Loire. Gilles de Rais was present at the Battle of Jargeau, at Meung-sur-Loire at Beaugency, and at the decisive engagement at Patay in mid-June, where the English field army in central France was effectively destroyed. He commanded troops. He was wounded. He fought, by every account, with conspicuous personal courage. On the 17th of July, 1429, in the Cathedral of Reims, the Dauphin was crowned King Charles VII of France. Joan of Arc stood beside the altar holding her banner. Gilles de Rais stood among the marshals of the realm, and on that same day, at the age of 25, he was elevated to the rank of Marshal of France. It was one of the highest military honors the kingdom could confer. Very few men in the history of the office had received it so young. He had everything. He should have had nothing left to want. 2 years later, on the 30th of May, 1431, Joan of Arc was burned alive at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen. She had been captured by Burgundian forces, sold to the English, tried by an ecclesiastical court controlled by English political interests, and condemned as a heretic. The French crown made no serious effort to ransom her. Gilles de Rais was not present at her execution. He never publicly commented on it. He never explained what, if anything, he felt about it. What is documented is that, within months of her death, the first children began to disappear from the villages around his castles. Part 5. The castles of Gilles de Rais sat across a stretch of western France that runs from the Loire Valley down into the marshes of southern Brittany. Champtocé, where he had been born, guarded the river. Machical, in the country south of Nantes, was his principal residence in the late 1430s. Tiffauges, a vast fortress on the border between Poitou and Brittany, was the largest of his holdings. There were others, smaller, scattered through Anjou and the Vendée. Together they formed a private kingdom of stone and farmland through which the marshal moved with his household, his servants, his choir, and his guard. Inside the castles, particularly at Machical and Tiffauges, there were chambers in the lower floors that the ordinary domestic staff were not permitted to enter. This was not unusual in itself. Great houses of the period commonly maintained private apartments for the master and his closest attendants. What was unusual was the quality of the locks, the placement of the rooms, and the small number of servants who were permitted access. In the years immediately after Joan's death, the spending of Gilles de Rais began to accelerate in a way that alarmed his family and bewildered his stewards. He commissioned a theatrical performance in Orleans in 1435, a religious play called The Mystery of the Siege of Orleans, which dramatized the campaign he had fought in with Joan. The production was staged on a scale that would have strained the budget of a small kingdom. He paid for the costumes of 600 performers. He paid for the construction of full-scale stage castles. He hosted free meals for the entire audience over a period of weeks. The total cost, by surviving estimates, would have been enough to maintain a noble household for a decade. He summoned alchemists. He paid Italians of dubious reputation to come to Tiffauges and attempt the transmutation of metals into gold. He paid a priest named François Prelati, a young Florentine cleric with claimed knowledge of the occult, to perform invocations in the castle's lower chambers. The invocations, according to later testimony, were attempts to summon a demon called Baron, from whom Gilles hoped to obtain knowledge, power, and the restoration of his depleted fortune. By 1435 he was, on paper, bankrupt. He was selling castles to his cousins and to the Duke of Brittany to raise cash. His family in Paris, alarmed, petitioned the king to forbid any further sales of family land. The king signed the order in July of 1435. Gilles de Rais ignored it. He continued to sell. The Duke of Brittany, Jean V, continued to buy. He had everything. He should have had nothing left to want. And yet he was emptying himself out, castle by castle, payment by payment, into an appetite that the contemporary observers could not name. In the villages around Maschcal and Tifudges, the parish records of the late 1430s begin to show a particular kind of entry. A boy goes to the castle to ask for bread and does not return. A boy is sent to deliver a message and does not return. A boy meets a well-dressed stranger on the road and is offered employment in the marshal's household and is never seen again. The entries are scattered at first. By 1438 and 1439, they form a pattern that the local priests began, quietly and carefully, to discuss among themselves. The villages began to keep their children indoors. Part 6. There were two men who knew what was happening inside the lower chambers of Maschcal and Tifudges. They had known for years. Their names were Henriette Griart and Etienne Correlaut. Etienne was usually called Poitou, after the region he had come from. Both had entered the marshal's service as boys themselves in the late 1420s. Both had been promoted over the years from minor pages to body servants, the most intimate and trusted of the domestic positions in a great medieval household. They dressed him. They served his meals. They slept in the rooms next to his. And according to their own confessions, given in October of 1440 in the presence of multiple notaries and never substantively withdrawn, they had spent the better part of a decade procuring children for him. The procurement, by their account, followed a routine. A child would be identified, usually by an older procurer named La Meffre, an elderly woman who traveled between villages on the marshal's payroll and recruited boys for what was described as service in the great household. The child would be brought to the castle. The child would be fed and made comfortable. The child would be taken, that same evening or the following night, to one of the upper chambers. The marshal would be waiting. What happened in those chambers is described in the trial transcripts. The descriptions exist. They have been published in scholarly editions and translated into multiple modern languages. They are not reproduced here, and they will not be, because the dignity that was taken from those children in the 15th century does not need to be taken from them again in the 21st. What can be said is that the killings were sexual in nature, that they involved deliberate and extended cruelty, and that the bodies were disposed of by burning in the great fireplaces of the castles, the ashes scattered in moats and cesspits. Henriette and Poitou cleaned the rooms afterward. They burned the clothing. They carried what remained of the bodies. They were paid well. They were trusted absolutely. They were, in the structure of a 15th century noble household, almost invisible to the outside world. What broke the case in the end was not the disappearances. The disappearances had been noticed for years, and nothing had come of it, because the people noticing them were peasants, and the man they were noticing was a marshal of France. What broke the case was a quarrel over a piece of land. In May of 1440, Gilles de Rais led an armed party into a church at the village of Saint-Étienne de Mermort, which sat on land he had sold to a treasurer of the Duke of Brittany, and was now trying to take back. He seized a priest who was saying. He held the priest prisoner for several days. The act was, under the law of the time, a clear violation of ecclesiastical sanctuary, and it gave the Bishop of Nantes, Jean de Mailstrot, a legal opening that the bishop had apparently been waiting some time to find. The bishop opened an investigation. The investigation, almost immediately, stopped being about the seizure of the priest. By August, the bishop had collected sworn statements from 49 witnesses in the parishes around Maschcal, all of them describing missing children. By September, an arrest warrant had been issued for Gilles de Rais and his entire inner household. He was arrested at Maschcal on the 15th of September, 1440. Henriette Griart and Etienne Correlaut were arrested with him. The three men were taken to Nantes and held separately. The trial began, on the 19th of September. When the confessions came, they came from the servants first. Henriette broke quickly. Poitou broke shortly after. Their accounts agreed with each other in detail across hundreds of specific points, including names of victims, locations of rooms, methods of disposal, and dates. Some of the details could be cross-checked against the parish records and against the testimonies of the bereaved families. The cross-checks held. Gilles de Rais initially refused to confess. He denied the charges. He challenged the jurisdiction of the court. He called the bishop a liar and the proceedings a fraud. On the 13th of October, faced with the threat of judicial torture, he asked for the threat to be withdrawn and offered to confess voluntarily. The threat was withdrawn. The confession was given. It was given again, in expanded form, on the 22nd of October. It matched, in almost every particular, the accounts that Henriette and Poitou had already provided. He was sentenced to death on the 25th of October. He was hanged on the 26th, alongside Henriette and Poitou, in a field outside the walls of Nantes. He was 36 years old. Part 7. 6 centuries have passed. The disagreement has never ended. The first wave of writers to take up the case, in the 16th and early 17th centuries, treated Gilles de Rais as a straightforward illustration of the doctrine of damnation. He was a devil. He had been seduced by Satan. He stood as a warning of what happened when a Christian soul fell into pride and lust. The fairy tale of Bluebeard, when it began to circulate in oral form during this period, was working in roughly the same register. A wealthy lord turns out to be a monster. The moral is, do not marry a man whose previous wives have all disappeared. The story did not need a complicated political reading. It needed only a closed door and a forbidden key. By the 19th century, the reading had begun to change. In 1891, the French novelist Joris Karl Huysmans published a novel called L'Abbesse, which translated into English means roughly down there. The novel was ostensibly fiction. A modern French writer becomes obsessed with the case of Gilles de Rais and begins researching him as a way of understanding the relationship between mysticism and evil in the medieval mind. The Gilles de Rais who emerges from Huysmans's pages is not the devil of the 16th century chroniclers. He is a tragic figure, a man of enormous spiritual hunger whose hunger turned in on itself when Joan of Arc died, and there was nothing left in the world large enough to hold him. The portrait is sympathetic in a way that earlier accounts had not been. It is also based, fairly closely, on the actual trial transcripts, which Huysmans had read. The Huysmans reading opened a door. Through the early 20th century, a series of French writers, occultists, and amateur historians began to suggest that perhaps Gilles de Rais was not, in fact, the monster the trial had made him. Perhaps he had been framed. The argument in its various forms went roughly as follows. He was enormously wealthy. He had been selling his lands at a panic. The Duke of Brittany had been buying those lands at favorable prices. The Bishop of Nantes was the Duke's man. The trial had been conducted by an ecclesiastical court with a direct financial interest in the outcome. The confessions had been obtained under threat of torture. The witness testimonies had been collected by investigators working for the same authorities. The whole proceeding was, in this reading, a sophisticated medieval land grab dressed up in the language of demonology. In 1992, the argument received a public hearing of a particularly modern kind. A French politician and writer named Gilbert Proudhon organized a mock retrial in Paris, convening a panel of judges and historians to re-examine the original transcripts and consider whether the conviction would stand in a modern court. The mock court reached a verdict of not guilty on the grounds that the original confessions had been obtained under duress and that the testimonies had been compromised by the political context of the trial. The verdict had no legal force. It had a certain amount of cultural force. It was reported in newspapers across Europe. Other historians, working through the same documents, have reached the opposite conclusion. They point out that the testimonies of Henriette and Poitou were given under conditions that included torture as a threat, but, by the surviving record, not as a fact. They point out that the testimonies agreed with each other in particulars that could not have been coordinated. They point out that the parish records of the missing children predate the bishop's investigation by years. They point out that even if the duke and the bishop wanted his land, that desire does not preclude the possibility that the man himself was guilty of exactly what he eventually confessed to. Each generation of historians has looked at the same documents and produced a different Gilles de Rais: the devil, the tragic mystic, the framed nobleman, the serial killer recognizable to modern criminology. The verdict shifts with the politics and the philosophy of whoever is reading. What it has not been able to do in 600 years is settle. Part 8. The documentary record, fortunately or unfortunately, is unusually complete. The trial transcripts survive in the departmental archives of Loire-Atlantique in Nantes. They run to over 200 folio pages of medieval Latin and Middle French. They were transcribed in the 19th century by the French archivist Eugène Bossard, whose 1885 edition remains the standard scholarly reference. They have been re-edited and retranslated several times since. Any researcher with adequate medieval Latin and a reading room appointment can examine them. The names of the witnesses, the names of the victims where known, the dates of the testimony, and the formal confessions of the 3 condemned men are all there, in handwriting that has survived almost 6 centuries with only minor damage. The physical sites have been less informative than the documents, but they have not been silent. Tiffauges still stands in the commune of the same name, on the border between the modern departments of Vendée and Loire-Atlantique. The keep is partly ruined. The lower vaults are partly accessible. A series of small-scale archaeological surveys conducted in the late 20th and early 21st centuries recovered bone fragments from disturbed soil layers within the castle precincts. The fragments were human in some cases, and in some cases were the bones of children. Whether they dated to the period of Gilles de Rais or to other phases of the castle's long history, the surveys could not determine. The soil chemistry of a site that has been continuously inhabited and modified for over 800 years does not permit precise dating without resources that no excavation has so far been willing to commit to a question that is, in the end, not legally actionable. Machical is in worse condition. The castle was partly demolished during the French Revolution. What remains is a fragment of the original keep, sitting in a public park in the modern town. The lower chambers that the trial transcripts describe are no longer accessible. They may not still exist. In 2008, a French researcher named Olivier Bouzy, working at the Centre Jeanne d'Arc in Orléans, published an analysis of the parish disappearance records from the deaneries around Machical, Tiffauges, and Champtocé for the years 1432 through 1440. The methodology was painstaking. Bouzy worked through every surviving parochial register, every notarial record of missing persons, every fragment of testimony from the families who had given statements during the original investigation. The total number of documented disappearances of children in those parishes during that 8-year period, according to his analysis, ran between approximately 140 and 180. The number does not match the most aggressive accounts of the case, which have sometimes placed the victim count as high as 600. It also does not match the most minimalist accounts, which have suggested that the entire affair was fabricated. It matches, fairly closely, the confessions that Gilles de Rais and his servants actually gave. The pattern is real. The arithmetic, when it is done carefully, supports the conviction. The framing theory does not survive the village records. What none of the modern work has been able to do is locate the bodies. The fireplaces of Machical, where Henriette and Poitou said the burning was done, were demolished centuries ago. The cesspits where the ashes were said to be scattered have been excavated and filled in and excavated again. The moats have been drained and reflooded. Whatever physical evidence existed in 1440 has, by 2026, been thoroughly absorbed into the landscape of Western France. The bones, if they are still anywhere, are in soil that nobody has been able to identify. Part 9. The fairy tale of Bluebeard has endured because a fairy tale can be closed. The story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The wife enters the forbidden room. She discovers what is inside. She is saved by her brothers. The lord is killed. The wife inherits his castle. The reader puts the book down and the story is over, and the reader's child goes to sleep without nightmares, mostly because the structure of the tale has done its work. A monster has been recognized and removed. The world has been restored. Gilles de Rais cannot be closed in the same way. He was recognized in the end and he was removed. The structure of the medieval ecclesiastical court did its work as far as the work could be done. He confessed. He was hanged. The two servants who had served him for a decade were hanged beside him. The bishop and the duke divided his remaining lands. The records were sealed in the archives of Nantes, where they have remained, available to anyone who can read them for almost 600 years. And yet the case does not stay closed. Every generation reopens it. Every generation looks at the documents and arrives at a different verdict. The devil, the tragic, the framed, the proven. The mock retrial in Paris in 1992 reached one conclusion. The forensic survey of the parish records in 2008 reached another. The Tiffages archaeology has reached no conclusion at all. The castle at Tiffages is open to visitors during the summer season. The upper courtyards have been restored. There is a small museum near the gate and a gift shop and a performance area where, on certain weekends, costumed reenactors stage medieval combat displays for tourists. The lower chambers are not part of the visitor route. The signage does not explain why. A careful reader of the guidebooks will notice that the historical material in the gift shop tends to emphasize the castle's role in the 100 Years' War and its architectural significance, and to treat the matter of its most famous owner with a certain professional discretion. Machical is even more discreet. The fragment of the keep sits in its public park, and most of the people who walk past it on summer afternoons are not aware of what was tried inside it 6 centuries ago. The most dangerous men in any era are not the ones the system suspects. The most dangerous men are the ones the system refuses to suspect. Gilles de Rais was protected, for the better part of a decade, by exactly the things that should have made him visible. He was rich. He was titled. He was a war hero. He had stood next to a saint. He had been raised by a court and by a culture to a position where the ordinary mechanisms of social observation simply did not apply to him. The peasants noticed. The priests noticed. The mothers of the missing children noticed. And none of them could speak loudly enough to be heard by the institutions that could actually have stopped him, until a quarrel over a piece of land gave a bishop a procedural opening. He had everything. He should have had nothing left to want. And yet he wanted, and the want went somewhere terrible, and the system that should have stopped him did not stop him, and the children of the villages around his castles paid the cost. The green hills of Brittany are still there. The ruins are still there. The documents are still in the archives at Nantes. The parish registers are still in the village churches, and somewhere in the soil around Tiffages and Machical and Champtissé, in fragments too small and too old for modern forensic chemistry to identify, the bones of an unknown number of 15th century children are still keeping account that no living person can verify. What do you think? Was Gilles de Rais guilty of what he confessed to, the worst killer in medieval European history, or was he the victim of one of the most successful frame-ups the medieval church ever ran? Should the lower chambers of Tiffages be fully excavated, even now, even after 6 centuries, even though there is no living family left to grieve? Or does the case belong to the past, to the archives, to the silence? Let us know in the comments. We read every single one. If this kind of deep historical investigation is what you are here for, subscribe and turn on the bell so you do not miss what is coming next. Until then, stay curious, stay informed. See you in the next one.